All right, I think we are at time. It's of the hour. So, hello. I think maybe some folks will keep trickling in as we go along, and I know it is the end of the day, so I'll hopefully be able to share some interesting new information that is both useful and actionable and something you can actually just take back and make practical in your team or in your organization's day-to-day lives. So I will go ahead and get this started. So the main thing we're going to be talking about today is productivity and engineering productivity and the way that we think about productivity now that so much is changing about the way we build software. Now, over the course of this talk, I think there's, everything has been on and around AI or in the extension of the AI space. And there's really two ways for us to talk about the AI value proposition and what it does for us and what it helps us do. With the first one being how we use AI to make our products better, and we integrate them into product experiences and change customer experiences. And the second one is really about how we use AI to make ourselves better, to change how we work, not what we build. And the entire focus of this talk is on how we use AI to transform the way that we work. Hopefully you've heard more than enough, or maybe not enough, still about the first one. But this is really where our focus is going to be today. So in order to do this, I'm going to talk about a couple of things, and then we're going to keep a big chunk of time at the end, hopefully about 20 minutes, for open Q&A. And I really do want to make sure that there's plenty of time for us to have conversations and to ask interesting or challenging questions based on things you see here that you might want to dig into a little deeper as we sort of pass through some of these main things. First, a little bit of context on sort of how work is changing. This might be familiar, this might seem obvious, some of it might still be new, but I'll share some of the broad trends we see. And then we're going to dive into EngThrive, which is the way that we at Microsoft really are focusing on how we understand, we reshape productivity, we optimize for the right things, and we create these great outcomes for developers. Cool. Okay, so productivity in the AI era. You have probably all seen or heard some version of this question in the last handful of months. I certainly know I have. You might even been somebody that asked this question. Well, hopefully you're moving past that. I certainly know that I have as well. The thing that's fascinating is that we asked this question for good reasons. So this question has been asked for the right reasons, and I understand why it was asked. Because we recognize that there's a fundamental change in the way that software engineers are working on a day-to-day basis. And when things are changing, when the way that we develop is changing, you need to have some insight. If you don't have an understanding of what's going on, it's scary. And so overly simplified, reductive metrics or answers to that question are really attractive. But they are, unfortunately, not helpful. They actually go from not helpful to actively harmful if you're really trying to drive transformation and you're trying to understand what's changing. So, and I mean, it's funny, actually, if we think back, how many years has it been in the industry that we really understood and recognized that things like how many lines of code does an engineer produce or how many PRs do they have is not a performance metric that is useful or meaningful in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it's been probably 10 or 15 years since I've had somebody come to me seriously and say, oh, we should be thinking about this, or when I'm talking with our partners, or when I'm talking with the industry. We've learned that, and yet somehow, in the last couple of months, pop culture and the news cycle has caused us to forget this incredibly important and foundational thing. And of course, we do understand, and what we have learned, is that where we actually spend time as engineers is varied, and it crosses a large span of different classes of work and different amounts of time. So at Microsoft, we do longitudinal studies across the industry and within ourselves to shape and understand where developer time goes. We publish a lot of these papers. I think one was published at the start of this year. And here are a couple summaries out of this. We use this foundational approach of dividing time, developer time, into 3 buckets, which is how much time you spend on innovation, how much time you spend running the business and keeping the lights on, and how much time you spend with sort of organizational responsibilities. This can be forms of meetings or trainings or various other things you just need to do as a citizen of the business. The thing that's fascinating is, the P50, what the averages are across the industry, is really how this time divides. Less than 40%, roughly 40%, is spent on innovation. 45-ish% is spent on keeping the lights on, and about 15% are spent on these other organizational responsibilities. And when you double click into this even further, the actual time we spent interacting with the code systems or with the technical systems themselves are only about a quarter of that. But the thing that's really wild is if you double-click in even a little bit deeper, the amount of time engineers, on average, are spending actively coding in functioning businesses is somewhere between 10 and 15% of their week. That number is not very large. We obviously all wish we had more of that time. Like this is, I think, a universal dream amongst all of us as engineers. But the reality of what it looks like in functioning businesses, in mature organizations, this is a pretty common pattern. So again, this takes us back to the deep understanding that attempting to reduce or to have a reductive view of what productivity really is with something as simple as how much code did you make or how fast are you making it is really wrong. So this then leaves us with the question of, okay, if we're transforming the way that we work and AI is breaking these bottlenecks and really changing all of this stuff, what is the question we are asking ourselves, and what do we really want to be seeking? And the good news is the answer to that is simple to say, difficult to do. And it's based on this idea. It's straightforward, right? We want to create more value faster. These are the objectives. This is the outcome. This is the thing that really we're trying to create for our organizations. So with this in mind, we'll take a couple minutes and talk about some of these other large-scale patterns that we're seeing in transformations with some of the highest performing teams. And then I'm going to dive into EngThrive, where really how we talk about this objective, how we measure it, and how we try start drive a flywheel of good change and improvement in the developer experience. So, like mentioned, right, the nature of the development loop is changing. Where the bottlenecks are changing. The nature of where we're spending our time and energy is changing. This little frame is something that we've been using broadly in Microsoft and externally as well. When we think about the waves of how work has really changed or how AI has impacted the way we work or the way we interact with it in the last couple of years. So in the ChatGPT era, just is not that long ago, right? It's like 3.5 years ago is when this started. We began with a very direct interaction, a back and forth transactional interaction where we ask the LM a question. At the start of last year, the second wave became possible. But in reality, that didn't start happening until like August, mid-year, a little bit after mid-year, where we really started interacting with agents and giving them asynchronous tasks, where we would give an agent a task, it could do stuff asynchronously, it could start to use tools as well. And right now, what we're in is this emerging third wave, where really we're working with agents on complex goals and where they have both tools, they have memory, they have entitlements, they have a variety of other things that lets them do more rich and complex goal seeking. And this is still very much emerging. I think we all recognize that. There's frothiness in how to handle certain responsibilities in here and how to really empower the agents. But we're seeing this mature, day by day by day. Okay, now what's fascinating here, I put classic SDLC, even though it makes me feel sad to write that. But here we are. So as we think about the software development lifecycle, this is something that's probably familiar to us all. A simple distillation of it. Plan, create, validate, deploy, operate. Historically, the vast majority of time, again, we could talk about, I'll share a couple percentages, but the vast majority of our time as engineers are spent in these two buckets, where operate represents something like 75 to 80% of time on average. Create is that 10 to 15% of like active coding that we sort of talked about a second ago. And plan, validate, and deploy consume the remainder. Now, this is not perfect and true for every organization. Again, these are looking at averages and large statistical data sets, but this is sort of the shape of the pattern that we generally see. I think it's also probably intuitive to most of us. We spend the majority of our time keeping systems working, figuring out how to optimize them, some creating, and then a handful of, the other pieces are a part of the picture as well. Now, the thing that's fascinating is among teams which are moving into that third wave, the way that we work and what the SDLC looks like is fundamentally different. And this has been one of the biggest and most transformational changes that begs a whole bunch of other really interesting questions, which is the vast majority of time and energy is being spent on plan and being spent on validate, where create is rapidly decreasing the amount of time, sort of asymptotically moving towards zero. And deploy and operate are as well, although not quite as fast. These ones are lagging a little behind how quickly agentic systems, models, harnesses, and the whole ecosystem is moving coding rapidly towards zero. Now, this is interesting, and to me, this is like really one of these places where we're seeing an identity crisis, something that's really challenging, difficult to understand or to internalize, is that code is rapidly becoming output of a system rather than input of a system, right? It has been the source of truth historically. Even still today, it's still the source of truth, but the way that it's written and the nuance by which it's written is starting to change its shape. And while this is true, I think something important to mention is that across the SDLC, while coding is one of the first to really to start to change and transition from being input to output, the nature of the models and how model capability is evolving is not happening uniformly across the stack. So, right, we see code becoming incredibly good. Like at this point, the LLMs, like the foundational models and frontier models, are capable of writing a single line of code as good as any of us. However, when it comes to system design and architecture and an understanding of sustainability of those systems, they're certainly not there. They're getting better, but they're not getting better as fast as fundamentally its ability to produce an excellent line of code. Verification, so as we think about that verify piece, there have been some improvements, and there's some stuff that they can do now that they couldn't even do 6 months ago, but they're not, again, they're like that. This is definitely sublinear in terms of the capabilities and the shape of where they're working. And then as you get to operations, much slower, and when you get to taste, they're not there at all. And in fact, I don't think that's going to change as time goes on. Taste is definitely one of the aspects that we bring to the table and that great engineers bring to the table and will continue bringing to the table. So with all of these things, the reason I show these is because, again, the nature of the highest performing teams, the most productive and highest performing teams, is changing. And what it is that we have to pay attention to and how and what those bottlenecks are, how we help enable those teams to do more, again, is continuing to change in some really interesting ways. And as we build on that point, it's important to understand that, right, AI is changing so much about how we work, but it does not change the fundamental concept of productivity, and it doesn't change how we measure productivity, right? If productivity is about the ability to create outcomes, the way that you think about those outcomes, the way that you measure, and the way that you understand those outcomes is the same regardless of what tools you use and the tools in your hands. Now, of course, AI is actually helping us understand outcomes in new and powerful ways. We'll talk about that a little bit. We can talk about it in the Q&A too, if that applies. But fundamentally, the idea of productivity is durable. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. So again, like I mentioned, in Microsoft, we have this, EngThrive is the name and the description for how we are understanding, shaping, and building programs around using AI to help our engineers be more successful. And this is the concept, right? This is the root of exactly how we describe it in the mission of this function, which is to make it fast and easy to build great work. Where fast and easy describe how we work, the engineering experience, the system, the whole life cycle of the SDLC, and great work describes what we make. And this triad is incredibly important. You can't have one or just two, you have to have all three. And you have to lift, there's no such thing as a teeter-totter in play here either, right? If you want to improve one of these, you want to make it faster, you have to make sure that you're keeping it easy and you're maintaining quality. Same thing across the board. You can't try to just crank a quality dial and then dial down your ability to move fast and easy, as sane as that, or as tempting as that might be in certain scenarios. So with this focus on making it fast and easy to do great work, we break all of our metrics and the structure by which we think of this into these three categories of speed, ease, and quality. So, fast and easy to do great work. Now, I want to take a second before we dive into the specific metrics and then get into some of the use cases that I want to share, because when we get to the final section, I'm just going to run you through a couple things that are hopefully great sort of case studies and use cases of how we applied it. I want to take a minute to stop and talk about activity versus outcome. I think that in this talk, if there's a single thing that you take away, is the importance of this concept right here, which is to pay attention, to measure, and to target changes in outcome, not activity. This is sort of like, there's another great phrase, which is progress over motion. Activity describes motion, outcomes describe progress. And I'll show you a couple examples of this. So like we started with that original question, how much more code did our engineers provide? That's an activity metric, not an outcome metric. Here's a couple, like inside of activity, there's really two different categories that you can use to measure these. You know, metrics that describe how we work and metrics that describe what we did. And there's a few in here. So, you know, like what's your AI adoption and usage? How many tokens are you using? You know, what are your PR counts? What number of agent-based PR counts do you have? These are all interesting, and they actually are useful. I don't want to say that they're not useful. They're interesting and useful metrics to have in order to understand how behaviors are changing, not to attempt to move on their own. These metrics are not metrics you target. When you target them, there's a whole bunch of side effects. I'll talk about that in a sec. Outcome metrics are metrics that describe what you achieve. And I'll double click into each of these in just one second. But speaking of activity metrics and the unintended and often very obvious side effects, so like token maxing, which is the thing you've probably been hearing about in the last couple months, where people are worried about, you know, people are just like grinding away tokens for purposes that don't actually create really any value, but because they've heard that they're expected to use a certain amount or be AI active in a certain way. This is exactly what happens when you focus on activity. In fact, like any of us in the room, by the time we go to sleep, could probably be, at our companies, the largest AI token consumers and the largest code producers of any person in the company. Right? All you have to do is open up your laptop, like create a new repo that's on the side that's not well paid attention to, like open up a whole bunch of terminals and start having these things just spewing out non-functional but Python-looking code. And every between 150 lines and 300 lines, make a new commit, push that commit into that location, and like just burn, right? This is obviously silly. Like that would obviously consume lots of energy, but produce absolutely no value. But that is activity, right? So it shows us, it's just like a demonstration of how obvious it is that when you focus on activity metrics, you end up with side effects like this. When you focus on outcome metrics, you actually create outcomes that really matter. And there's one other one before I get in there. I do want to talk about this, and this is a fundamental concept of the way that we do EngThrive. EngThrive is not focused on measuring individuals. It's focused on measuring systems. So if you think about that speed, ease, and quality, you know, how fast am I able to go from an idea to production? Or and if you double click into that, you can be like, well, how long does it take for my build to complete? That's not an individual performance metric. That's a measure of the system that I operate in. The life cycle of the system that I'm a part of in order to complete a job, in order to create value. So the idea of attempting to distill productivity into an individual metric is also non-functional. It doesn't work. That's performance. You know, employee performance is a whole different conversation, and it's much more nuanced, and it requires all kinds of other stuff. Productivity, again, is measured at the system level and how that system impacts individuals. So let's double click on the three most important of these metrics that we pay attention to, we manage towards, and we do have significant investments around speed, ease, and quality. Speed, the best metric we found is this one described as idea to customer. How long it takes in calendar days or hours to go from an idea to a customer. Where like the origination of that idea can be a PRD taking shape, a ticket being formed with an idea in it that doesn't even have a design doc, or like no engineer involved, or maybe an engineer wrote it. The point at which this thing becomes something real, all the way to the point in which it's in the customer's hands, where you've gone through experimentation or treatments or your canaries or whatever the case may be, and it's actually creating value. That whole timeline is incredibly powerful to understand, because of course, you're gonna need to be able to double click into different areas to see where your bottlenecks are in that life cycle. The second one, this one is pretty fun as well. This is innovation time, or an innovation time ratio. So remember at the start, we showed that donut diagram where innovation time is 39-ish% roughly there, how much time you have for innovation. That is a number that you want to drive as far up as you possibly can. Like 80 or 90% is a really, really great target for that number. And so we are super attentive to where our engineering time is going and how we can then find what are the things that are sucking up that time and how we can minimize those. Now, especially with AI, because AI is allowing us to break many of these old bottlenecks, which have just been a part of software development for decades now. And then finally, quality. This one's a little bit tricky. So like I have just product quality, measures of defect escape, resilience, and experience. I think quality is, this is fairly well understood in the industry, like looking at defect escape rate, or what we describe as is incidents per PR, looking at what your mean time to mitigate is, so how fast you're able to respond, and then, of course, always you want to have some kind of metric which measures customer experience or product love, or however you want to shape that out. And I'm going to put this eye chart up here. This is more for reference. I'm not actually going to run through all of this. But just to show, this is really the state of the art of where we are inside of Microsoft with the metrics that we are attentive to and that we've driven to be as consistent as possible across the entire business. And when I say that, and this is actually a point I'll remake again later, so we'll double up on this one, is the importance of having company-wide consistent metrics can't be overstated. In order to really start optimizing systems, you need to have a common frame for how you describe and how you talk about these. But I will also say, we've been working backwards towards these and the shape of these substantially over the last few years. So this is really sort of like where we are and the nature of our North Star as well. So it's uncommon that you're starting in a position like this, but I hope that these are useful. And we'll talk about the application of these in just a second. Okay, so we've got metrics. Imagine that you have metrics, or you already have metrics, and you're thinking about things that are really great outcome metrics. What do we do next? And this is where we go from talking about maybe some things that are new and you haven't heard before to talking about just good old-fashioned program management, like how we actually run programs of transformations in organizations based on good driving directional metrics. So the key operational principles of EngThrive are a few things. One, we focus and create space to identify, understand, and execute on our bottlenecks. So what are the bottlenecks in the SDLC, and how do these measures help us understand what those are? We create space to do that. Two, we create leadership accountability for development experience. This is done at the absolute highest level. So we start with Satya. I started doing this with Satya in the SLT 3 years ago. In shapes, as we were evolving, and our metrics were certainly not as mature as what I just showed on that eye chart a second ago. We really only started with a couple, and then iterated and grew. And then finally, this one is, I'll explain why this one's so important, but this is the focus on the idea of continuous improvement rather than hitting a particular benchmark. This one is important to add because this was the single largest, people asked me this question more than any other question as we were starting to roll out these programs and change the way that we thought about developer productivity. Leaders across the board. There was a almost visceral fear of like, well, a reorg just happened and this other team came to me and so my benchmark is gonna go from here to here and I'm gonna be punished for it and it's bad. No. That's obviously not the point. The point is that we're focusing on constantly asking, understanding, what can we do in order to improve developer experience? How do we make it faster and easier to build great products? So the drive for continuous improvement is actually incredibly important when you're thinking about putting these kinds of things into practice. Whoops, let me not bang that anymore. Now, this is sort of a North Star, and again, this describes the way that we're running the program now. But I can also promise that anybody starting on something like this, whether you have something and you're evolving, or if you don't have something but you are thinking about how to really institute and measure and understand and drive some of this change in your own organization, these are things that you want to work backwards towards. So like I mentioned, that first point, consistent company-wide metrics. You want to do everything you possibly can to not have a bunch of fragmented metrics. So for example, like focus time, we talked about innovation time. Focus time is a piece of that. Focus time comes directly from Viva Insights. So if you guys are using some of this tool chain, like Viva Insights gives you focus time right out of the box, which is incredibly powerful. And in fact, actually, I'll talk about one of the 2 case studies I'll share with you is related to focus time. Dashboards, obviously you want real time as much as you possibly can. They help people self-serve and actually take action. We want business processes to drive accountability and change, and this is like really driving and running ROBs. And then finally, and this is important as well, is that as you start to see, and especially now with AI playing such a big role in the transformation, is you start to see patterns or reusable ideas that you can use that will help you change. You want to gather these and share them as much as you possibly can. Cool. Okay, one other piece of good news, if you're early in your journey, is that it's always the right time to get started, because the odds are really big wins are low-hanging fruit. They're easy to grab onto. And that is exactly what I'll talk about here. So I want to now share 2 quick case studies of what we did and how we ran some of these programs and some of the outcomes. And both of these case studies occurred in periods of time that were between 8 and 12 weeks. So very small, but with really substantial outcomes, driven based on great outcome metrics, on the outcome metrics that we've talked about. Also, yeah, perfect. So we'll just dive in. So the first one was a focus on focus time. So what focus time is, actually here, we'll get right here. So like, why focus time? Or actually first we'll say what it is, right? What focus time is the amount of time, the number of hours you have in a work week that are not being interrupted by things like meetings. There's a handful of different things which contribute to focus time that sort of break up that focus time. We wanted to ensure that the majority of developers' time was focus time. Why? Well, I think you probably intuitively understand why having time to focus is important, but like this is the key to getting into flow. We have an enormous amount of research and studies, again, longitudinal studies and Microsoft internal studies that show just profoundly different outcomes for developers that have more focus time versus ones that have less on almost every dimension that you can imagine wanting to move. So this idea is incredibly important. Now, the way that we started up this flywheel, and I'm gonna, this is not super technical, but this is very important from a process and an organizational standpoint if you wanna sort of understand and replicate. And I'll share some of the lessons or maybe the takeaways from this in a second. But to start this up, the first thing we did is we, at the senior leadership level, picked one metric to focus on. Rather than going to the org and saying, okay, everybody go and find the metric, find the most optimal metric or the most important one, we used information from developer surveys, which are a great and powerful source of data, to understand what some of their biggest pain points were. And one of the things that rose to the top was a sense of feeling fragmented, a sense of not having enough time to just focus and get stuff done. So we picked one metric to start across the org. Then we defined roles with clear accountability. So every engineering leader in this organization, inside of 𝗲𝗏𝗧, which is Jay Parik's organization, we defined specific roles. So every engineering leader at the highest level was responsible for improving this metric immediately with really clear, with clear intention and focus. We set up bi-weekly reviews. So literally every 2 weeks, we came together. Each leader had a chunk of time, like 5 minutes over the course of an hour, to say, this is the state of our data. This is exactly what I'm digging into, and here's how I'm making some changes to the way that we're working in order to attempt to move it. And in 2 weeks, we'll report back on what's changed. We'll decide where we double down or how we pivot or how we evolve. And then, of course, every one of these conversations was grounded in the data. And this, like I mentioned, was focus time. So this largely came from the Viva Insights, and then we enriched it with some additional telemetry, developer instrumentation and telemetry that we had. Oh boy, that is a little bit difficult to read. So let's see, actually, I'm just gonna skip to this one then. Okay, so here are the outcomes from that work. In 8 weeks, by running that program, by having this focus on an outcome metric that we care about, we recovered, on average, right, the P50, 2.1 hours of focus time per engineer per week. We saw an increase in 13% in PR velocity, which again, that's not an outcome metric, but it shows a behavioral change, an activity change. This means that we actually got developers back into flow. And right, this is a metric that sort of is an indicator of that. We saw a 25% decrease in our bad developer day telemetry, which I don't have a chance to talk about, but actually we did just publish a paper in the last couple of weeks on EngThrive that dives into bad developer days a little bit more. And then we saw this decrease in a couple of these really annoying, wasteful patterns of meeting across the organization. So in just a few weeks, we recovered, the equivalent of 55,000 hours of engineering time by doing just good hygiene and cleanup work. Now, there's one other part of this. Oh yeah, so I was saying, why this example is, again, we did it fast. So much of what we did in here was not based on AI or using AI. It was based on using information that's coming from AI. The ability to manifest this data is really only possible now that we're able to use AI to analyze this data to give us a great outcome metric, which we can then act on in a new way. The other cool thing too is that part of this focus and fragmentation time was based on these operational challenges that engineers ran into and they were running into all the time with just keeping the lights on and keeping the business running. That is where we were able to apply AI in new and interesting ways. Like that was actually the origin of SRE agent. So our agent, which handles like so many of our SRE tasks, which now, or not SRE tasks, really just operational tasks, system health tasks, stuff that no one wants to do, but is important for the stake. And like, while the SREs now get to focus on really doing rich, great SRE work, building out deeper understandings of the shapes of the systems. So this example, like I think this example is great in that it shows how fast you can make progress when you just hone in and actually really build a business rhythm around one of these pieces of data. Cool. Now, I'll talk about another one. So this is the next case study. It tells a slightly different story. This one is actually much more rooted in AI, but really interesting. So this is a speed metric, time to first PR. How long does it take for a new employee or a person who changes teams to submit their first PR in that team? We wanted this time to be in less than a week. We were not less than a week when we started. We were more than a week, a decent amount more than a week. For the whole company, across all of Microsoft. So this is affecting many, many, many tens of thousands of engineers or technical folks across the board. So again, yeah, what it is, cool, why? I think, oh, and actually I didn't mention the why. Why is this so important? Intuitively, you probably understand that like getting into the actual development experience fast is important. It changes trajectories. We know that beyond intuitively. This is extremely empirically. The outcome for engineers who are coding faster, they're like, it's crazy how much it impacts multi-year trajectory and success. Like, again, very, very strong and interesting and powerful correlations with long-term success. So what did we do in here? There were 4 major things that we did over the course of just 8 weeks while looking at this metric and deciding we wanted to invest in and drive this metric in the right direction because we know it's an outcome metric that's related, that's essential to speed, ease, and quality. Right? This first one is we built an agent. It's called First Mate. That is there on day 0, like it's there on day 0, and the moment a person is online, they're attached to this thing, they're hooked up to it, it has information about their team, where they're going, and its objective is to help them begin their engineering work and get their first PR through, and then sort of move on to the path towards their 10th PR. We pay attention to time to first PR, time to 10th PR, and time to 30th PR. We invested in actually building this well-grounded agent. 2, we started improving the documentation for pull request workflows. Interestingly enough, not so much for the consumption of the human as we thought it would be when we started. They turned out to be far more useful for the consumption by First Mate, by the agent, which then in turn was like this really great flywheel of fast self-improvement for the agent. 3rd, we created video exercises. This again kind of seems silly. It's like creating a PR, isn't this easy? But actually putting visuals, when you're coming into a new company, 1P, the first party systems are often different than anything you've seen before. And we have a number of systems that are internal that are different than if you're using Azure from the outside. So we actually created visual things to help people understand the flow of those tools and what those essential tools were. And it was astonishingly effective. You would also, I wouldn't be surprised if you said like, are you telling me you didn't have great, easy video documentation in the past? The answer is no, we didn't. And the reason why is because there was not an impetus for it. I mean, it should have happened, but the focus on these outcome metrics created the impetus to do the thing that had been deprioritized or sort of always one of those, oh yeah, we'll eventually do it when it matters. And then finally, we had to spend time and energy talking to managers around the business and communicating. We did this via like one of our company all-hand leadership things where all leaders were together to really emphasize that we have to change and set and raise our expectations for how quickly new engineers in a team, like new to the company or transferring from the team, are able to onboard. Now, this is fun. I was asked this question a number of times. But wait, right? Isn't this metric so easy to game? Like, what does a first PR tell you? Couldn't they just put in a no-op, like comment commit on some repo? And the answer is absolutely, and it does not matter, because the results were amazing. It doesn't matter if the first commit is a no-op. What it means when you're able to put a no-op commit through to production is that your machine works, you're attached to the infrastructure, you understand the deployment cycle, you understand how your code is present, you understand what you needed to do to get code reviews, to go through that whole cycle. You're already exposed to it. So while it seems easy to game, When you game an outcome metric, you create the success that you sought to create. That's the point. Like if you can game an outcome metric, you get promoted. If you can game an activity metric, well, welcome to the game. Like that's what anybody can do that. So we saw this incredible improvement. We were able to get down to our target. Now what's also wild, again, as I mentioned, time to first PR is this fascinating indicator of a whole bunch of other things. It also changes your trajectory. So by the time you get to your 10th PR, we can predict with high precision what your coding activity, the time and the energy you spend actively in systems, how much time you will have for innovation, for actual direct coding, we can predict it extremely accurately. And so by compressing and accelerating these, we saw massive positive outcomes and changes in developer behavior, the activity. Again, activity is not just the objective. We also then can correlate these to people being able to move idea to production faster. We correlate it to them being able to have having more time to focus on creating new value and less time focused on just toil and on keeping the lights on. There's an entire set of behavioral and pattern changes that happens when you actually drive time to first PR and time to 10th PR down. So again, sort of one of these great examples of why this matters. And that was sort of the point. Why this matters. When you have a metric that's an actual outcome metric and you game it, you win. And this is one of these great scenarios where really AI allowed us to transform and tackle a problem that we couldn't reasonably tackle before, like having to read mountains of documentation and maintain that documentation and all of that jazz. Like, the moment you write documentation, it's already out of date. And so this is just sort of the nature of the game. Okay, with this in mind, we've still got a solid 10 minutes left for Q&A. And like I mentioned, here's a couple of the key takeaways as you're thinking about productivity and you're thinking about how we actually drive programs to transform and create better developer outcomes, make it faster and easier for engineers to get work done. Of all of these, if there's one thing in here that's the most important, take away outcomes over activity. This is the most important thing right now. And this will keep and stay durable as the way that we work and as AI changes the tools that we hold on a daily basis. Outcomes are everything, and activities are constantly changing. Cool. All right, so I don't know how Q&A works here. I guess you just have to shout. Okay, or is there somebody with the microphone? Okay, great. We had a hand up right there and another hand up down there.
So you talked about focus time. So the
Yes.
two things that immediately came to mind are daily stand-ups and Teams messages and just communication between teams and others. How did you address those?
Yeah, great question. So one, Teams messages we do not count as a thing that knocks people out of focus. There's enough data that the way people work and communicate, especially with remote teams, it's the equivalent of being able to have conversations and it's used for work. Now, you could very rightfully so argue that there's certain classes of messages which are totally distracting. You're right. So part of what we do is in different teams and across the business talk about, or provide some best practices on using Teams, how you set up notifications, various other stuff like that, in order to help you minimize distraction and sort of keep things elevated that you need in order to collaborate. Stand-up meetings, we exclude. Or actually, let me be a little more nuanced in that. There are certain classes of meetings which we can detect, and in fact, Viva is capable of detecting as well, to know what they are, how many people are invited, what the rhythms look like, and what the titles are, to understand are these clear working meetings. And even with that still, the thing that we did and that we pushed for in the org was to compress the meetings, whether they're recurring meetings or whether they're non-recurring meetings, into blocks. So for a period of time, and actually this still largely stands true, is that if you're an IC, don't be booked into meetings after 1 o'clock or afternoon. The other thing is, as it relates to stand-ups or recurring meetings or individually scheduled meetings, we made a very specific point to speak to the whole organization, to speak to people across the board, to say any meeting that exists has to have an agenda, a purpose, and you need to be there for the right reason. If you are invited to one and the agenda is not clear and defined, the purpose and the outcome of that meeting is not clear and defined, we expect you to cancel, to not go, to decline it. And so it is we are not only giving you permission, we're setting the expectation that if these criteria are not met, then don't go. When it comes to stand-ups and other stuff, again, it was really like, hey, set your rhythms for these, and if these are things that are part of your operations and aren't blowing it up, we actually we excised those from the focus time detractors. Good question. Yeah, perfect.
Hi. Regarding the outcome, how did you measure that? Is it like is it just a number of PRs? Is it like how big? Yeah, that was my first question. And the second question is in terms of the focus time. Is there like a minimum focus time for this to work that you measured, like 2 hours, 4 hours?
Yeah, great question. I'll answer the second one first, and then I'll get back to that eye chart. So the second one is, yes, so focus time. So we did a bunch of these studies, and across industry, we partnered with some other folks doing studies in this space too. What does it take to get into flow? There are sort of 3 positions that have been taken over the years, and most are gravitating towards one of the 3 answers, which is 60 minutes, 90 minutes, or 120 minutes. Meaning you need a contiguous block of time that is one of those 3 sizes in order to actually be fully into flow, into the high production complex thinking that's needed for hard problems. We subscribe to the 120-minute approach. And it's funny, I actually started, and prior to this, I ran a bunch of this stuff at Google, and then prior to that, I ran the platform and infrastructure at Netflix. And I was in the 60 to 90-minute camp previously, but after really digging into it and then seeing out what the objective outcomes were, we moved over to the 120-minute. Now, again, when it comes to outcomes, none of these are related to PR volume. PRs are a part of them. So again, idea to customer is related to PRs. Time to first or time to nth PR is a PR gives you a point in time, but volume, flow, throughput's not a metric on here. And that's key. That is absolutely key. Now, again, I want to reiterate this point. Activity metrics are useful. They're useful to understand because activity metrics show you how behaviors are changing. But the moment you manage to it or attempt to move an activity metric directly, the metric is lost forever. It becomes meaningless. The moment an incentive is set around an activity metric, it's no longer actually informative of behavior because the unintended side effects cause that number to lose any meaningful fidelity. This again is why we go here. So by so explicitly not focusing on those kinds of the activity metrics from an outcome standpoint, but just to understand transformation, we've largely been able to keep the activity metrics useful. So for example, we do look at how much are people using AI? What does token use look like? How has it affected coding velocity? Those things tell us where we are on that first or second or third wave of AI usage. They at least give us a pointer in that direction, we can see that these teams are working in these ways. They're consuming sort of exponentially more tokens than others because they're working with teams of agents towards goals. Okay, that's good to know. Are they doing more? That's the question that matters. Is okay, are they spinning in circles and just lighting piles of money on fire? That's not the goal, but it's useful to understand. And then we can look at them and say, okay, how much more is coming out of these groups from a feature, from an idea to customer standpoint, or the throughput? What's that? What are we comparing? What is more? I think you're talking about change over time. Yeah, sure. It can be features, fixes, changes, reductions in operational burden, whatever it so you can features, bugs, enhancements are sort of 3 classic categories of how you think about the different kind of work going through. We use those in a handful of others as well. So among teams that are some of the heaviest coding users, we look at and understand of the changes that are going through, how many are new features versus how many are addressing work items that are just necessary to keep your system alive. We think of these, we think of this as our secure future initiative. Anytime where there's security updates or dependency managements you have to do or migrations, we are able to separate and understand what those look like and what the throughput of those are, so that again, as we're thinking about idea to customer, we're not only looking at calendar time, we can also then understand throughput or volume as well as an outcome. Yeah, good question. Perfect. And I think we've got time for another question or two. Yeah, go ahead.
How does one get executive buy-in for these kinds of things? Say I'm not the executive, the team lead, but
Yeah.
I have to convince, like, as you said, the
Ab-
highest ups in my company to adopt these.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. Okay, so your question is how do we get executive buy-in to actually pay attention to the outcome metrics and to care about these things? There is, I wish I had an easy answer for this. I think the point, the answer to this is by speaking up. So I say this, it's funny, I say this at Microsoft frequently, and I say this across the industry to folks and friends who I try to advise, is as IC engineers and as first-line managers, as second-line managers, as wherever we are, we have way more power than we think. The engineer on the ground who's doing work has the ability to say, in a way that they don't often exercise, it is impossible for me to do the right thing, or it is so difficult for me to do the right thing. In order to do the right thing, we need to fix this thing that impacts our speed, ease, or quality. It doesn't mean stop all work, but like, I have an idea on how we can improve this. This is a thing that we need to be able to improve. Here now, we can use AI to tackle some of these classic bottlenecks in new and incredibly fast ways. Like these things I just showed you are company impacting across Microsoft and tens of thousands of engineers. And of the two studies I show you, the teams that did these were, one was 5 people, one was 8 people, and it was done in less than 2 months. Both of them were done in less than 2 months. This is the power of now where AI is actually allowing us to break old bottlenecks. So it doesn't have to be huge teams and huge organizations. Small teams that are focused and ambitious on these problems and that speak up and fight for these things are actually really capable of driving incredible change. And then the framing, like the reason why this focus on outcomes versus activities, how like these are really durable as our work changes, simply talking about this and having common language is one of the most effective ways to change the views. And I can say this like even as an exec, as I talk to my peers, these are people who are strongly opinionated, who've been in the industry for decades, they're rooted in their ways of working. I have to do it as well. It doesn't like, it's the same. We still have to create an understanding for why this is valuable. So your question is absolutely right on. We have more power as ICs than we often remember. And our ability to tackle some of these problems in really creative ways now is more open than ever. The fruit is incredibly low-hanging. Cool. Excellent. Okay, I think I've run a minute long, so I don't want to hold you all before, since this is the end of the day, you probably want to have something to eat or drink. Perfect. Thank you so much.